Today in our 2018 Ford Expedition, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Roadmaster Brake-Lite Relay Kit for towed vehicles, part number RM-88400. So whenever we're flat towing our Expedition and we turn on our turn signal, if we hit the brakes in our motorhome and our supplemental braking system kicks in, it's going to override that signal. And our turn signal is not going to be blinking anymore, and it's going to turn solid, which that can be a big safety hazard because we want our turn signals to work all the time. That's where our brake-light relay is going to come into play. And with our brake-light relay installed, if the brakes are applied in our Expedition, it's not going to cancel out that turn signal. So now that we've seen our brake-light relay work, let's show you how to get it installed. To begin our installation, we're going to come to our driver's side, and we're actually going to be starting right at this panel right below our steering wheel. You're going to want to take a trim panel tool and come right around the edge on either side, and that panel should pop out. We'll release the clips, and this panel is going to come down away from the dash. And that'll give us a lot better access behind here. We're also going to have 4 bolts holding this metal piece and the plastic panel in place. So we can grab a 10mm socket and start pulling those out. Then we'll just lift up slightly on this panel and we'll set it aside. In our plastic panel, before we fully pull it away, we either want to disconnect all the electronics or make it to where we have enough slack to where we can swing it out of the way where they won't be getting pulled on and getting damaged. And if you reach behind here, there's a couple squeeze tabs. We'll squeeze them and it should release this panel. And we should have enough room that we should just swing this out of the way to where we don't have to disconnect all the electronics. Now behind that panel, if we find this white and blue connector, that's going to be connected directly to our brake pedal here. That's going to be our brake switch. And we're going to need to test each one of these wires. So we're going to want to remove this fabric tape that's surrounding it. You just want to be careful not to damage the wire when you pull that off. You want to expose a decent amount of the wires so we have enough to work with. Now when you're testing your wires, you're going to want to use a multimeter. You're not going to want to rely on a test light. And what we're going to be looking for is on each one of those wires, we want to make sure we're not getting any voltage when the brake pedal is released, but when we press it, we want to get 12 volts, just like we're getting on this wire here. And that's going to be the purple wire with the white stripe. Now you want to be careful because there is another purple wire but that has an orange stripe on it. The wire that we want to use off of our brake switch is the purple wire with the white stripe. So now that we found the correct wire, we're going to want to cut this wire down from the plug itself a little bit. Then you're going to want to strip both ends of that wire, but since it's such a thin gauge wire, you're going to want to strip a little more than normal. And then on each one of those wires, we're going to take a butt connector from our kit and we'll crimp it in place. And since we stripped a little bit more than normal, I'm actually just going to fold the wire over on itself. That way it has a little bit more to grab onto on the inside of the butt connector. And make sure you have a good crimp. Give it a quick tug on each end of the wire. Make sure those are in place. Now we can grab our relay harness. Now our harness is going to have several wires coming off the back. In our application, we're not going to be using the green wire at all. So I'm actually going to cut the wire pretty close to the relay holder, just so it's out of the way. We'll start with our blue wire, and each one of these is going to be pre-stripped. So we'll just pull the insulation off. I'm going to trim back some of that because we don't need all that wire to go in the butt connector. And we're going to take our blue wire and we're going to put it into the butt connector that's closest to the brake switch itself. Then we'll crimp it in place. Give it a quick tug to make sure that we have a good connection. We can take our black wire now, and that's going to go into the other butt connector that's furthest away from the brake switch. Now our white wire, we're going to take the ring terminal from our kit, we'll slide it over, and we'll crimp it in place. This is going to be our ground. And fortunately, we have a ground right here, so we can grab an 8mm socket and pull that bolt out. And the ring is going to be a little small to fit around the stud, so instead of taking the bolt all the way out, what we're going to do is we're going to take a pair of cutters and we'll cut a notch out of the ring terminal. That way it's more of a C shape. We can wrap it around the bolt that way, making sure it's making full contact, and then we can tighten it back down. So we have one more wire left. It's going to be our red wire, and this is going to need to be hooked up to a power source. But since we have a push button ignition, we're going to want to hook this up to the tail light circuit on our towed vehicle wiring. Our relay kit is going to come with a length of red wire, but this isn't going to be long enough to reach our towed vehicle wiring. So I'm going to be using some 16 gauge wire so I can pass it through the firewall. Now you can pick up some extra wire here at eTrailer.com using part number 16-1-1, and that'll be 16 gauge wire by the foot. So we'll pull back the insulation. I'm going to fold the wire over, and we'll take one of our butt connectors, slide it over our wire, and we can crimp it in place. And we'll take the length of wire, strip back the end, and put it into the other end of our butt connector. So we ran our wire over to the firewall on the driver's side here, where we already had some wires and air lines running through. But if you don't, you can just cut a slit in this grommet, it'll come right out in the engine bay. Now the grommet we came through is just the outside of the brake reservoir right behind our air box on the driver's side firewall here. So we have our wire out, and we have our 4-pole wire tied right here because we knew we were going to be tying into it. So I'm going to cut the zip tie so we can get access to our taillight circuit, which is going to be the brown wire. So we're going to need to separate our wires so we can get just the brown wire. Now there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can take a knife and cut around the brown wire, or take a pair of cutters and very carefully cut it. Just keep in mind, if you do cut any of the other wires or even nick them, you're going to want to reconnect them with a butt connector so you have a solid connection. And now that we have access to our brown wire, we'll cut it in half and strip back both ends. Now we're going to want to grab a large butt connector, and we'll crimp it onto one side of our brown wire. This butt connector is not going to be in your kit, but you can pick up these heat shrink butt connectors here at eTrailer.com. Crimp one side in, then we'll take our wire that we extended from the inside from our relay. We'll cut back the excess, we're going to strip the end of the wire, and we're going to combine it with the other end of our brown wire and put it into the other end of our butt connector. These are heat shrink butt connectors, so I'm going to use a heat gun to shrink it down, but if you are using an open flame, you want to be careful not to burn or char the connector or the wires. So with all of our wires hooked up, we can put our relay in. Now this is only going to fit one way, so you don't have to worry about putting it in incorrectly. Then we can take a zip tie or two, tidy up all our wires, and mount the relay out of the way. So if you take a zip tie, you can actually zip tie your relay at the top there. It's going to have a hole through it, and you can secure all the wires to this wire loom up out of the way. And then we can put all of our panels and hardware back in place. Line up all the clips. put our panel back. That'll finish up your look at the Roadmaster Brake-Lite Relay Kit for towed vehicles, part number RM-88400 on our 2018 Ford Expedition.